You're listening to the Peace Corner podcast. In each episode, we talk to a different peace builder working in a different region, telling a different story. To hear more, please click subscribe. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and more.
Jon Rodriguez Torres, who is the Executive Director of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. To us, human security and our work on conflict prevention and peace building are two sides of the same coin. We cannot understand working on prevention or working on peace building without having human security as that reference point. Human security is so rich as a concept. It explains so many things that at the same time it's very hard, I think, to make it operational. And one of the challenges of human security in the next 25 years is going to be how we can make this concept operational. How can we move from the theory into the practice and say, hey, this is not only a theoretical framework, it's an actionable framework, and you can work on that. In that regard, I think the UN and other multilateral bodies have that role to enable us to have those conversations that will lead us to be more free from fear, free from want, and free from indignity. Thank you.
That was GPPAC Executive Director Jon Rodriguez Torres speaking at a UN high-level event about the concept of human security and the challenges and obstacles we must overcome to achieve it. To learn more about how this can be done and the role that civil society organisations must play, we spoke to Jon Rudy. A long-time peace builder with more than 3 decades of experience in the field and in the education sector, there are few more well-equipped to discuss this topic. Hello, Jon. Welcome to the Peace Corner podcast.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you here in the Netherlands. Are you enjoying it?
I'm very much enjoying your warm weather.
Yeah, it's a rarity in this part of the world, but nice when we have it.
Yeah.
So let's dive right in, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, can you still remember when you became interested in peace building?
You might have to go back all the way to my childhood. I'm a middle child, so I was either making conflict between my sister and my brother, or I was solving it. I say that a bit in jest. Fast forward to my early years in working in a refugee camp in Somalia, trying to do development work in Southern Africa, realizing that conflict was actually, and destructive conflict and violence were undoing a lot of the work that we had been hoping to do in the development world. And so I think I kind of pursued that question, so what's going on here? Why is there these dynamics, these social, political, economic dynamics that are breeding such destructive conflict, and so I think that it's been a gradual winding to that. I didn't start out as a peace builder. Certainly, right after my high school years, I was an electronic technician. So I think being a generalist is a pretty important thing.
So what encouraged you to pursue it as a career in that sense? What was there a prompt for the change?
Yeah, I think that, kind of pursuing that is a natural outgrowth of looking for the connections between things. And, that's one of the things I've come to understand is how interconnected all things are. And so I think the peace work is a logical kind of endpoint of many of the things I've done in my life, and so I guess essentially I would define what I do as trying to reconnect things that kind of violence has pulled apart, and I think we call that peace building in its most generic sense.
Bit of a metaphor with electrical engineering there as well.
Right.
So you've worked in peace building for over 2 decades. You've been involved in projects all over the world.
Actually, 3 decades.
3 decades, including a lot in Southeast Asia and Africa. I saw kind of back and forth between those two you were for a while. What do you think has changed in the world in terms of violent conflict and peace building over that time, and especially recently?
It seems to be that it's more pervasive, that violence as a modality for change. I think on the one hand, humanity is learning nonviolence actually gets you what you want in terms of change better. On the other hand, we have all these cultural forces that are pushing and reminding us daily that violence is the only game in town in terms of change. Whether it's whether it's computer games, whether it's movies, whether it's the examples that we have. And I think what's changed here is something we're understanding through brain research, and that's completely out of my pay grade. But I've been reading enough about it and enough about what it does to the brain, what violence does to the brain, to understand perhaps as everything else has gone global in the last years, so has trauma. And so maybe the ruts we are in as a human species in terms of responding violently is actually part of the changes in the brain, part of the accumulated trauma that humanity is and has experienced. They're telling us that memory is passed on through genetics now. What does that mean if I come from a group of people who's been traumatized? How is that imprinted on my DNA? Again, out of my pay grade, but this is hard science that's beginning to tell us this. And so back to the connectivity piece, there's a lot of things we're learning from science, from social science, from neurobiology, all of these things. And peacebuilding is starting to take all of this into consideration and network and connect in order to work on some of these wicked problems we have.
It's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Not a viewpoint you hear often, I suppose. Maybe time to start thinking a little bigger. A
little bigger, yeah. And,
so, as a senior fellow for human security at Alliance for Peacebuilding, an organisation with a vast network of peacebuilding organisations, including GPPAC, that aim to tackle issues together, why is it that working together is so important in this field? What is it that, as you spoke of these connections, how does bridging these connections help us?
Well, we talked a little bit about how some of these very specialized sciences or social understandings or political understandings, how those things, they are specialized. So I, as a generalist peacebuilder, right, really need help from some of the other disciplines, some of the other sectors to address how complicated and embedded in systems these are. And so we need each other, and it's in needing each other and then developing the fora, if you will, to be able to network and work together on various things, that we find new pathways forward, new avenues. Let me give you an example here. I just got done teaching an artistic peacebuilding course with another professor at the college that I was teaching at. I don't have many artistic bones in my body, but this guy was a professor of music education. And together we worked on a course that was so wide-ranging. We did dancing and we did, drumming, and we painted a piano, and we went out and stuck our feet in the soil and put our hands on a tree. And, the students were able to see the breadth of connectivity between art and peacebuilding experientially in a way that they couldn't if it was just me doing artistic peacebuilding or my coworker. And we demonstrated that these seemingly disparate things, and of course in the peacebuilding field, art and peacebuilding have always gone hand in hand, but perhaps in the minds of the students, they go, what? How is this, what are these connecting? Well, let us show you, and it's in that connectivity that we discovered many new things, and even us as facilitators of that course.
Yeah, because I think it'd be very close-minded for anyone in any discipline to say they couldn't learn more, even about their discipline, from bringing other sources of knowledge and information, even it doesn't matter how wide-ranging it is. Politicians especially, I think
there's a group of people.
I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson. I saw a scientist. He was saying, where are the engineers, the scientists in politics, the peacebuilders? Having a more interdisciplinary look at politics, because it's mostly lawyers and career politicians at the moment. And I feel that's one area we could begin to change, at least.
Yeah.
Great. So, one of the more difficult problems with peacebuilding is often its lack of visibility, maybe something you tackled here working with other disciplines. making it extremely hard to sell what is being done. Why is this such a challenge, and how can we change that?
I think inherently, and I'm going out on a limb here, but inherently peace building should not be a profession. As we understand connectivity, I think every discipline, we should go out and this is for younger people, right? Go out and study the thing you're passionate about and add communication skills and add the mindset of what you are doing to enhance the greater common good in your community and address those persistent social problems. So perhaps it is that guys like me are dinosaurs, right? You know, I stumbled into this, I call it my profession, but inherently it's an unstable profession because the very reasons that you mentioned. It's not a profession that anybody should be doing. I long for the day when I don't have to travel the world, but I can stay home and bounce my grandkids on my knees, which I don't have yet, but I will. You know, and not worry about these global problems where people are hungry and there's injustice and there's rape of forests and resources. So does that?
Yeah, I mean, it must be one of the few professions where ideally you work yourself out of it.
And we long for the day when none of us has to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of your the big areas you've worked in peacebuilding and with us here at GPPAC is human security. This concept you've been involved in a lot in your career, especially in recent years. So before we go into the specifics, could you define what human security is and how it differs from national security?
Yeah, it's so basic. It's almost it's almost simple. Although in its simplicity, of course, is its complexity. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from indignity. And in those three things, I think we can find most of the injustices of the world when those are missing. And that when you begin to frame security in terms of, well, let's take the third one, dignity. Right? The lack of dignity. How many times have I heard people say they don't respect us? I was sitting under the trees in the Mindanao, Philippines, with the 105th Base Command of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and they were telling me those people in Manila, they don't respect us. And I thought, wow, there it is. It's this inherent disrespect. And what is it a disrespect of? It's the dignity of each person. Making a people group. It's any of the isms, racism, sexism, classism, elitism, is the inherent disrespect of the dignity of anyone that is not in that group. And so, most of the wars are fought over that, ideally. I mean, not ideally, but at their base. And so, and it breeds the other ones, hunger and fear, right? Hunger is basically at its, freedom from want. Well, there's tremendous hunger in the world today. And so, if you look at the root of a lot of that, there may be violence at the root, there may be some kind of injustice, there may be some kind of marginalization. All of those things, though, have a component of dignity in them, or indignity, if you will. So I think reframing then the concept of what security is. National security is involved, and I would say, lest I sound too dogmatic here, it takes a balance of human and national security. I think in our world today we're pretty focused on national security and its cousins. National security says, well, what's good for our borders, what's good for our economy, what's good for our, and you put anything else in there that doesn't start with people first. There's an assumption, I think, on the part of people pursuing national security that this is good for people, but it is not a formula that starts with people first. And I've often thought in our political discourse sometimes, especially in the U.S., we have deep chasms of understanding between sides. I wondered if we started to say this, this move is good for policy. It's good for our side in the political discourse. We actually ask the question: is this good for my neighbor? We might start with a different discussion. We might go in a different place than if we were if we're party first or political group first. So
absolutely. I mean, I think the US is a very interesting example because it's a country with tremendous resources and everything that it does have, and the amount that is spent. And the amount is used on military spending. I think it's more than half of the GDP, or it was at some
obscene.
point. And
it's $800+ billion a year, outspending every other nation
combined. I think
almost combined. It depends on whose statistics you're looking for, but it's close, if not. And the Institute for Economics for Peace is telling us annually we spend 14.3 some trillion dollars cleaning up violence, responding to violence. These are obscene figures in a world today when we really know how to do things better and differently. Now, what you might argue, well, we're not, if we knew how. That's where the Peacebuilder comes in. No, we have some thoughts here on this, and we're trying to assert those as much as we're able.
Absolutely. So coming back to human security for a second, before I started my internship here at GPPAC, I was studying my master's in Leiden nearby, and one of our classes on conflict was about human security, or the concept of it. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions put to us is the concept of human security just hot air, on the argument that it's difficult to define, and some of my colleagues believed that it was, I think, from more an academic standpoint. And I even think my professor, she was leaning more towards that way, but I genuinely was like, just because a concept is difficult to define doesn't invalidate it. And that was what I was trying to put across. Maybe you could help me articulate that for when I go back after my internship so I can win next time.
Security is one of those words, like justice. It's hard to define, but when you don't have it, you know it. If I'm walking around the streets in fear, I don't have security, all right? So it's very stark in its absence. And to sit in a classroom and pontificate whether we have it or not.
Yeah. Everybody here does.
I'm tempted to use some expletives here now. But so part of when we talk about security or justice or some of these hard to define words, we actually would do well to have a conversation with the people who are telling us that they don't have it. Freedom from want. Who are we listening to when we talk about food security? Freedom from fear. Who are we talking about when they say, we could use enhanced security? Are we talking to militaries who come into a place and tell people what their security needs are? And this is why I love working with GPPAC. We have these tools like the multi-stakeholder process. In the larger human security handbook, the curriculum that's written, a multi-stakeholder process says, hey, in order to figure out, what security is, we need to invite the people around the table who are expressing insecurity and hear their voices before we make any decisions about, and be that human or national security. And so freedom from dignity, it's one of those things when you are indignified, it. When I have to decide, are you indignified?
Yeah.
Without asking you, I may or may not come to the same conclusion as you. So
nobody really gets to the call on other people's indignity, unless they're your child. Apart from that, I think it's should be left up to them.
And yet the children are giving us, they're giving us some clues as to when they feel indignified.
Absolutely. So. Recently, our executive director here, Jonahs, spoke at a high-level event, a UN high-level event in New York about human security. And one of the questions he put forth is the challenge of human security and how can we make it operational? How can we move it from theory into practice? And I wanted to put that to you and see what your thoughts were.
Yeah. And again, I would go back to this resource of multi-stakeholder processes. Who is making decision now, and how do we move them to more inclusive processes? A lot of civil wars are spawned because of the lack of voice. And again, you can trace that back to indignity, right? where are the processes with which people have the venue to speak and to be heard? It's not just speaking, it's being heard, because speaking happens in all kinds of ways, right? Like if it's not about voice, if it's not about, and ultimately the ability to speak to a system or a framework that they feel is completely wrong, there's something wrong, so I wonder if getting at human security involves, and maybe we build this up from the ground up in our communities, in our neighborhoods, by saying, wow, do I even know my neighbors? Do I even know what their concerns are and what, and it may even go back more fundamentally to our ability to listen. Do we have the skills to hear, especially across some of these divides that fragment communities? I don't know, maybe that was a long kind of response to that question, but
it's a difficult one. I just want to also, are there any areas where you've seen examples of this working in the field?
Yeah, let me think here. So there are, again, I'll go back to the Philippines. You had structurally a number of peace processes. So the government structurally had said, look, we have these conflicts going on, we're going to make this Office of the Presidential Advisor to the Peace Process, OPA. But that's, it's kind of a cabinet level, it has a whole infrastructure, and yet how does that actually work at a ground level? And so you've had fits and starts with that, understanding what some of the issues are. You have had basically track one and a half, negotiating peace, but really it has had to have been a listening process through a number of iterations in order to figure out, well, look, even if we sign a peace agreement, will people on the ground adhere to that? Will they even know about it? And so I think they've been fairly successful in kind of pulling together some listening processes and coming to that conclusion. And also in the track one process, they've invited outside observers. They had a international contact group, which were outsiders kind of resourcing, listening. And so it's not just one side talking to the other, but you have these track two facilitators kind of resourcing a process. So that's one of the examples I can think of.
That's great to see that. So within this human security area, to stay on it just for a little bit more, what is the role of civil society organizations? What's the best part they can play here?
I think amplifying the voice when there's been one missing. Civil society has connection right down into local communities. Also, and often civil society does have connections up to track 2, track 1. And so it forms a bridge, it forms a connectivity piece with very rigid constraints about how they operate, how they keep trust in all sides. And so, a lot of what we call traditionally the security sector needs to understand those constraints if they're gonna be working with civil society. And I've been in places where civil society's been fairly weak, and so the missing element there is government tries to do everything, and of course government has limited resources, so that's not possible. Civic groups often arise where there is space to kind of fill the gaps, and when it works best, they coordinate with each other. When it works worse, they're in competition for the same resources, and I've seen that as well. So, civil society is that, in many places, that safety net where the voices are aggregated and then spoken into the levels that are deaf to those. I can't imagine a world without civil society because, it'd be a world devoid of a feedbacking mechanism, I think, in in society.
Even less level of a playing field than it is now.
Yeah, and certainly a population who is lacking some of the basic freedoms, I think, that are necessary for dignity. And,
So it keeps coming around to that. Is that your main take of the three? One, fear, but indignity being...
Well, living in fear, living with hunger. Look, if I'm hungry, there's not a lot else, and you can go back to Maslow, and saying, look, what's my next human need? Well, it's the next breath, and none of us has a contract with the universe that we can actually have the next breath. So, yet alone clean water and food and
I suppose in a sense, fear and want, hunger is easier to point out.
They are more basic.
Afraid, but indignity is harder to close in on.
And perhaps it's why, the Band-Aid effect is so easy. Like if somebody's hungry, let's mobilize, let's do this. But in terms of addressing the longer term needs, indignity is that longer term protracted kind of maybe root cause that may be connected to the other two.
Not being able to supply your own food is an indignity in itself. It's not something someone should have to go through.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Jon. It's been very insightful. Just for this season, we've just decided to add a couple of questions that we ask each Peacebuilder, and hopefully we can compare and contrast their answers to see how different Peacebuilders see similar issues. So let's start off with, what is something you hope to see achieved in the world of peacebuilding globally or locally within the next year, or 5 years if you prefer?
Within the next year. I want to see continued cohesion and intersectionality. So in the U.S. we have a lot of movements that have rose up in the last couple of years, and they are getting the intersectionality of their work with other work. Climate change, for example. A lot of poverty issues can be traced to climate change. You can also connect it to a very unsustainable global economic system. And so whether you're working at economics or whether you're working at some kind of social cohesion, whether you're working at kind of political reform, to begin to look at the intersection of those issues, the connectivity, the ways in which you can join forces, work shoulder to shoulder with someone else. I've seen that, and I'm really excited as to how that is coming together, actually globally. I heard a speaker once talk about how humans are kind of like antibodies. We see something wrong in the world, and we organize, and we go to the thing that is wrong, or the thing that isn't working right, and we're like antibodies in the illnesses on the planet. Well, we have the global challenges now with climate change, that we really have a pretty short window if we're going to even capture this. And so I think climate justice, environmental justice, is one of those overarching issues that everybody's going to find some intersection with. Shifting our energy paradigm has got to be at the top of the list of things.
Yeah, I believe it's also believed among some scientists and geographers that climate wars might become a thing soon. Water wars, fighting for fresh water and that kind of thing, especially in areas prone to drought, could become a new source of conflict.
Which is really ironic because, and this is why I say energy paradigm has to shift. The sun irradiates this planet every day with more energy, dozens, if not hundreds of times more energy than we use in a year on this planet. What? Why are we pumping dead dinosaurs out of the ground and making a greenhouse out of this little blue ball? So shifting that paradigm, and the other thing is, sun is democratic, right? Like you get as much as I do, And then with
depending where we live.
Yeah,
I'm from the north of England.
Right, okay, if you're in Arizona or...
Yeah.
But it's unlimited energy, which will allow us to desalinate, which will allow, it'll free up almost every other resource on the planet. And so, and it's free. It's just out here, and we know how to do it.
Yeah.
And yet we've got stuck policy, and people becoming wealthy off the old paradigms that we've got to figure out how to help along.
Do you see a cohesion between the civil society organizations on the climate change and the conflict side of operations beginning to merge in what they're doing at the moment? Or is that just something you're hopeful for?
I think it is. People are making the connections.
Yeah.
When I teach a lot younger folks than myself, and I'm very hopeful when I see just how quickly they piece things together and say, yeah, of course this is connected here and this is how we can do it. And so
it's almost like education works.
Is that what that's called? Oh, thank you.
I've heard.
I learned something today. Right. No.
Great. So finally, if you could debunk one myth or common misconception about peace building, what would that be?
Yeah. So I've taught nonviolence a lot, and it's the utility of nonviolence. You can approach nonviolence from principally with a deep held set of values that you bring into the work of nonviolence, like King did. But we're figuring out that actually nonviolent change is the most effective way to get what you want, because violence just creates all these overtones of problems and issues and trauma and whatever else. In nonviolence, you're actually building the very institutions and foundations that you want in the movement. And so dispelling this myth that nonviolence is rolling over and let people do anything they want, but it's actually a very, very powerful and effective tool for change. I know this is a completely different direction we've been talking about, but it's one of those things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about the dynamics of violence and studying nonviolent change. And I wish our writers and our movies, our screenwriters and our science fiction writers would help us imagine nonviolent change as the basis of their books, rather than there was some human dystopia and then we, you know what I mean. But start out with the fact that we got it right in terms of social change, in terms of choosing the methodology that was most helpful and constructive, and then creating your imaginary worlds in your books and your movies based on some of these principles. I don't know. There's a lot of other things I'd like to change.
Maybe we got it so right that the aliens wanted to take it.
It's always that way. That the aliens want to do to us what we've done to each other on this planet for years. Well, let's change that paradigm. And some writers are actually coming together and doing that. I want to see a lot more of that.
Another example of connections being made, hopefully.
Yeah.
So. Great. Well, thank you for being here today, Jon.
I was happy to be here.
Okay,
I really had a good time here.
The rest of your trip.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Peace Corner. If you're interested in hearing more from us, please click subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you might be listening.